Hello, everybody. I see we have about 50 people online already, but I'll give it another minute or 2 minutes and then we'll get started. Thanks.
Greetings, Prof. Greetings to the rest of the team.
And greetings to you as well. Hi.
It's Vusumzi here. Thank you for receiving me.
It's our pleasure. I hope you enjoy the webinar. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Okay, it's 3 minutes past and we're up to 70 plus people. So I think maybe we should get started. Greetings, everybody. My name is Stephen Devereux. I'm a research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies, University of Sussex in the UK. And I'm also linked to the Centre of Excellence in Food Security at the University of the Western Cape in South Africa. Today's seminar is being recorded. If you have a problem with that, then let us know. It's being recorded so that we can upload it to the website afterwards, and you will find recordings of previous seminars in the series on the website, the IDS website, under the food equity page. I should just mention this is the last seminar in this current batch. We will start again with a new set of seminars in September. So the Food Equity webinar series is the latest in a series that engages with scholarly debates, policy and practice on equity across the food system, critically exploring different ways of experiencing equity or the lack of it at different scales and in relation to a variety of food challenges. A guiding question for the series is, what does an equitable system look like for food at multiple levels, and how can inequities be addressed? So speaking of multiple levels, today's topic drills down to the local level and looks at the role of local government in securing the right to food in the context of contemporary South Africa, where this issue has suddenly become very topical. I'm sure that most of you will have seen or read about the unrest in South Africa, which made international news headlines last week. The looting of supermarkets and shopping malls was no doubt triggered as much by poverty and food insecurity as it was a political protest against the imprisonment of former President Zuma. Our speaker today is Professor Jaap de Visser, Director of the Dullah Omar Institute for Constitutional Law, Governance and Human Rights in South Africa. He's a professor of law at the University of the Western Cape. His research, teaching and consulting work focuses on multi-level government, local government, good governance and federalism in Africa, and he has published widely on these topics. I also want to introduce right now Professor Julian May, who will moderate the discussion after Jaap's presentation. Professor May is Director of the Centre of Excellence in Food Security at the University of the Western Cape. So you can see there's quite a concentration of University of Western Cape people here. And he also holds the UNESCO Chair in African Food Systems. So Julian has a keen interest in food security, food systems, and food equity, along with the rest of us. So without any further ado, let me now hand over to Jaap, and please do switch off your microphones and your videos while Jaap is speaking. You will be allowed to open up your mics and your videos after in the Q&A session. Thank you. Over to you, Jaap.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thanks for that very kind introduction, and welcome to everyone. I'm really happy to see such a wonderful turnout. Also slightly intimidated by so many people taking an interest in the paper that I'm about to present. So wonderful to have you all here with me, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about the research that I've done on the role of local government in food security. Let me share my screen, and I'm assuming it's all visible, and if not, I'm sure somebody will let me know. So the topic is municipalities and food security.
Visible.
Is it visible? Okay, great.
Yes, it's visible. Great.
Topic is municipalities and food security, a constitutional analysis, and it's based on research that I've done looking at the intersection of food security and the role of local government and the broader system of multi-level government in South Africa, with some also it's a bit of a look across the borders to see how this would apply elsewhere on the continent, particularly in countries that have similar constitutional arrangements as ours, particularly when it comes to socioeconomic rights. So I'm very happy to be able to present this paper to you this afternoon, and I look forward what you make of it and how it lands with you in your particular context, working in a municipality or engaging in scholarship on the issue of food security or constitutionalism, federalism, local government, etc. So I'm not a food security expert. I'm a constitutional lawyer. So I'm not really sort of equipped to deal with the big policy issues around food security. I will gladly leave that to those who are much better qualified on that than I am. But I'm rather focusing on the argument of whether there is an argument to be made for the role of local government in realizing the right of access to food. It's based on a chapter that was published in this book, edited by Robert Holm, Land Issues for Urban Governance in Sub-Saharan Africa. It was published by Springer. And I also want to point to the work that was done by Jaap Johnstone, who published a thesis on food security and local government in South Africa, the role of municipalities in a food systems approach. We did that work together. I was her supervisor, and that thesis was approved about a year and a half ago, and should be available via the university's website. And a lot of the arguments that I'm making, I have developed together with Dr. Johnstone. Now, so basically the arguments that I'm making is sort of to rebut the notion that food security is a national or provincial concern in South Africa, because quite often the argument is made that food security, well, must have something to do with agriculture. It's about producing enough food, and local governments don't really involve themselves too much in agriculture. They are really about delivering basic services. So food security is sort of outside of the domain of local governments. Now, of course, the experts in this room know that food security is not just about producing food. It is much more of an issue of access to food and affordability of food. I think that argument is very well traversed in the literature on food security. So that in and of itself, I think, hollows out the arguments that because it's linked to agriculture, there's very little relevance of local government. But I want to tease out this argument using constitutional law, and it's about two arguments that I will set out in a moment. But first, looking at the role of municipalities and where does the argument come from that municipalities don't really have a distinct role to play when it comes to food security, because it will be an argument that you will hear, particularly municipalities make, when they feel that they're being charged with new responsibilities. They're fairly quick to argue, well, this is not my lane. This is not what I'm supposed to be doing. We are a local government. We're responsible for delivering basic services, economic development at local level. But the realization of food security is not really our mandate, because municipalities have constitutionally defined mandates. I'll quickly put up a screen. I don't want you to spend too much time looking at this slide. We'll return to it later. But this is basically what the Constitution says is the core mandate of local government. There are 2 lists in the Constitution, and there's all these issues that municipalities are responsible for, ranging from local tourism to pounds, to noise pollution, air pollution, street trading, licensing of dogs, etc., etc. Now, we'll return to this slide a bit later and look at it more carefully. But just for the purposes of the arguments, just take note of the fact that food or food security is not mentioned here. It's also not the type of issues that are listed in this list of competencies, but you won't see any direct reference to ensuring food security here. And you also don't see a direct reference, for example, to housing. Human settlements is not listed in these 2 constitutional lists either. And those 2 issues, I just want you to make a note of, because it's important for the development of the argument, that you're aware that those 2 issues are not in the list of constitutional powers of local government in South Africa, because these 2 lists, Schedule 4 Part B and Schedule 5 Part B, are the core constitutional competencies of municipalities in South Africa. They don't list food security and they don't list housing. So that is the constitutionally defined mandates. And in principle, municipal funding, in other words, the funding that municipalities run on, is generally based on that mandate. And if you look at what is municipal revenue, it's a combination of money that they receive from the central government, mostly in the form of an equitable share. And if you analyze how that is calculated by the National Treasury, you won't see issues around food security, access to food, or access to housing even worked into that formula. There'll be conditional grants maybe linked to that, but in principle, it's not part of the municipal funding arrangements. Also, municipalities charge fees for trading services. They sell you water, they sell you electricity, they deliver refuse removal services, etc., etc. And those are important sources of revenue for a municipality, but of course linked to that service, and in principle meant to cover the cost of that service. The most broadly defined form of revenue is property rates. That's a tax which they can use for any purpose that the municipality would want to use the money for. So there is a broad argument to be made that the municipal funding arrangement is generally based on that constitutionally defined mandate, which doesn't include human settlements and doesn't include food security. You take it even a step further in the age of public auditing and the emphasis on prudent financial management. Municipalities are in principle not permitted to spend money outside of their mandate unless there's a specific legal basis. Of course, municipalities can be asked to do additional things in terms of contracts or specific arrangements, and then there will be a funding arrangement attached to that, and then they will be permitted to spend money on that. But in principle, municipalities will be quick to argue that we're not allowed to spend money outside of this mandate, because that would be unauthorized expenditure, or it would take us in conflict with the Auditor General. We're not permitted to spend outside of this mandate. For example, during the hard lockdown, the issue came up, and it may even come up again now in the wake of the food insecurity in KwaZulu-Natal. I remember a circular being sent out on behalf, I think it was of the provincial government in the Western Cape, saying to municipalities, don't spend money on buying food parcels for your residents that are in despair as a result of the lockdown and the food insecurity, because you're not supposed to do so. There are other departments, there are other spheres of government that are responsible for this. Rather work with them, help them to distribute the food parcels, but don't actually spend your budget on purchasing food parcels, because you're now spending money outside of your constitutionally defined mandate. So there's a big discussion in local government on, how does our mandate link to our funding, and where are we supposed to spend money, and what happens if we spend money outside of our mandate. So it's not an unrealistic, it's not an unwarranted argument by municipalities to say, you know, we need to look carefully at what we are constitutionally responsible for before we engage in expenditure and engage with that mandate. Now, I want to bring in sort of two constitutional points, almost sort of countering that, and arguing that there are two constitutional points of leverage to argue that municipalities are indeed constitutionally responsible for significant parts of realizing the right to food, because there is a right to food in the Constitution. And my argument is that this brings municipalities into the picture. Section 27(1)(b) of the Constitution says that everyone has the right to have access to sufficient food and water. So this is another part of the Constitution in a separate chapter from those two lists that we talked about earlier. That is more the part of the Constitution that deals with the division of powers and functions. There's, of course, the Bill of Rights in the Constitution. It appears much earlier in the Constitution, and that where the right of access to food appears in the Bill of Rights. And my argument is that this brings municipalities into the picture. Secondly, we, of course, again, I don't need to, I think I'm speaking to the converted here. Food, access to food, food security is not about production alone. It is much more about a food system that needs to work and give access to food, make food affordable and accessible. And again, I argue that this approach brings municipalities also into the picture. Working this argument out a bit more about the right to food, that first line of argument, how the right to food binds municipalities. And I want to go back to the landmark Constitutional Court judgment in the Grootboom matter, which I think many of you would have heard of. It was the second ever judgment of the Constitutional Court in a socio-economic rights matter, and it was really the judgment where the Constitutional Court set out its approach to adjudicating socio-economic rights, such as the right to food, even though this case was about the right to housing. And this judgment has a, I think, a particular has also placed in my memory, because I was a young researcher at the Community Law Center at the time, and we were part of the litigation as an amicus, as a friend of the court. And my then boss, Professor Nico Steitler, said, you know, we're doing this amicus, and we've got a few excellent experts in the Community Law Center that are focusing on the socioeconomic rights dimension of it, on how to interpret the right to housing. But in this litigation, which centered around an eviction in Wallisedene, where a group of a community was rendered homeless and essentially litigated against the state on the basis of the right to housing, saying we've been rendered homeless, we want the state to realize the right of access to housing that we have in our particular circumstances. That was the case essentially about. The Community Law Center submitted an amicus brief based on how to interpret socioeconomic rights. But my boss then asked me, why don't you write something about the question of who does what? Who is supposed to implement this right to housing? Is it the national government? Is it the provincial government? Or is it the municipal government? Who is actually responsible for implementing the right to housing? And I will never forget that I attended the hearings of in the Grootboom matter in Braamfontein at the time. And the issue of the who does what, we had worked it into the papers, but sort of a bit more as an afterthought, as an annexure, because obviously it wasn't the biggest issue. The biggest issue was, how do we make sense of this right of access to housing? But during the hearings, suddenly it became a big issue. And I will never forget Justice Kriegler, who's very imposing justice. You know, it's already a very imposing atmosphere in the Constitutional Court at the time, with these, you know, judges lined up and firing questions at counsel. And Justice Kriegler thundering down from the bench, almost sort of shouting, but who does do what? Who must do what? You know, and he was clearly, the court was seized with the issue of who are we supposed to be holding responsible for which aspect of the right of access to housing. Now, in the actual judgment, it turned out a bit differently, and I think, and obviously correctly so. The Constitutional Court basically said, well, this is a right in the Bill of Rights, and the three spheres of government, they're all involved. They must all do their bit, and they must make sure that they act reasonably, also in allocating responsibilities and ensuring that they actually govern cooperatively to implement the right to housing. So it was maybe a bit of a fudge, but I think correctly so, given the importance of the judgment for the actual interpretation of the right to housing. The issue didn't go away though, because the issue kept coming onto the agenda of, how are municipalities responsible for the right to housing if housing is not listed as a constitutional competency of local government, yet municipalities are intricately involved in housing matters in human settlement. So the issue came to a head in the Blue Moonlight judgment, again for the Constitutional Court. Very briefly, it dealt with a community that was evicted from private land. This community approached the city of Johannesburg for alternative accommodation. And the city of Johannesburg essentially refused to accept responsibility and said, this is a housing issue. This is a housing crisis. Housing is not a constitutional responsibility of municipalities. This is a national or a provincial issue. So please go and knock on their door. We are not responsible for implementing the right of access to housing. The Constitutional Court disagreed and said, no, you as a city of Johannesburg, you are responsible and you have to find alternative accommodation for this community, even though you did not evict them. And even though they were evicted from private land, they have been rendered homeless, they have been rendered destitute. And in terms of the Bill of Rights, this means that you are responsible as a local government to do whatever you can, whatever is reasonable to offer alternative accommodation. So even though housing or human settlements is not listed as a constitutional competency of local government, the Constitutional Court said that doesn't matter. There is a Bill of Rights that makes you responsible for making your contribution to implementing the right to housing. So on the basis of that, I'm arguing that municipalities cannot escape responsibility for realizing the right to food, because a similar argument will apply there. Municipalities cannot say that they're not responsible for realizing the right to food, for example, by saying food is about agriculture. We don't do agriculture, so please, that's not our responsibility. Or food is about social welfare. We don't do social welfare. Please go to national or provincial government. I'm saying that will not fly because it is a constitutional duty under the Bill of Rights. What this doesn't solve though, and this has also been the critique, I think, on the Blue Moonlight judgment, or maybe not a critique, but at least a footnote there, is obviously this judgment or this approach doesn't solve the funding problem. It allocates the responsibility through the Bill of Rights to local government for, let's say, realizing the right to housing or aspects of realizing the right to food. But obviously, it doesn't allocate funding. And this problem of the funding arrangement for municipalities being linked to their constitutional mandate hasn't really been solved through these legal arguments. However, I think the argument stands that municipalities cannot escape responsibility. So municipalities can be taken to task, also legally, in terms of the Bill of Rights, for those aspects of food security that intersect with a municipality's constitutional powers. And this is where one would take the approach of saying, what powers does a municipality have in terms of the Constitution, and where do those powers actually intersect with the right to food? Where do they actually, if implemented well, do they make a contribution to realizing the right to food? And I think to do that exercise of looking at the mandate of municipalities and linking it to realizing the right to food, I think the food systems approach is a very useful approach to take, because it obviously looks at realizing the right to food in a much more broader, through a much more broader prism than simply looking at production and narrowly looking at food security. Now let's return then to what municipalities are responsible for. And I briefly put up that list earlier in the presentation just to highlight the absence of food security as such and housing as such in that list, and then argued after that actually those responsibilities have come in on the back of the socioeconomic rights jurisprudence of the Constitutional Court. But looking at the municipal powers listed in Schedule 4B and 5B, these are powers of municipalities. National and provincial governments, in principle, may not exercise those powers. They may only regulate them. And here's the list again. And if you look through this list, so we now know that aspects of the rights to housing have been added to this list, essentially by the Constitutional Court through the Blue Moonlight judgment. And arguably, we don't have a judgment yet in this issue, but arguably aspects of the rights to food can also be added to this list once there is a judgment that clarifies what local government's responsibilities are when it comes to realizing the right to food. But over and above that, you can already see in the list itself, you can see that there are lots of competencies, lots of areas of municipal responsibility that clearly intersect through a food systems approach with the right of access to food. For example, municipal health services, the licensing and control of undertakings that sell food to the public, very clearly linked to food security. The issue of regulating street trading, I think one of the most important competencies of local government that has a huge impact on accessibility of food. Refuse removal, refuse dumps and solid waste disposal, markets, abattoirs, trading regulations, water and sanitation services, but also public transport, the regulation of municipal public transport. Those of you who are engaged in food security in a broader sort of policy domain will immediately be able to make linkages between these areas of responsibility and food security. Also billboards, what do municipalities allow to be advertised on billboards, and how does that have an impact on food security and healthy food consumption, etc. So adopting a food systems approach and looking at municipal competencies through that prism already links local government to food security without actually demanding additional resources or additional functions to be exercised by municipalities. To take one example, municipal planning is one of the biggest, I think, and most important competencies of local government listed in the Constitution. Just unpacking that a little bit more and looking at how it links with food security. Municipal planning has been interpreted by the Constitutional Court, and the Constitutional Court has been very forthright in saying that this is a local government competency. There are now no fewer than 7 Constitutional Court judgments where the Constitutional Court said this is a function of local government and other spheres of government may not interfere with this function. And municipal planning essentially, is sort of, probably very sort of rudely or crudely defined is town planning. The spatial planning, which is the making of spatial plans for a city or for a municipality, as well as the decision making on land use management applications, your application for a subdivision or a rezoning or another type of land use management instrument that you apply to your municipality for the particular use of your land parcel. Essentially, that is what municipal planning entails. Now, what does it mean for food security? Is there a link between that responsibility that municipalities have, and it's a very classic local government role, town planning? Two issues can be mentioned immediately. For example, the role of municipalities in controlling agricultural land. Taking it back to the agricultural dimension to food security, the production element of food security. Municipalities play a key role in deciding what land will be used for. They exercise this role of town planning also over agricultural land. So how they use that power is very, very important in terms of preserving prime agricultural land and not giving in to, I think, to I suppose I would almost call it an instinct that municipalities have to convert land into land that can be developed, because the more land that you developed, the more buildings that you allow, the more property rates you will receive from that land. So it may always be attractive for a municipality to approve the conversion of agricultural land into land that is developed, because it's much more valuable for the municipality. Converting a piece of beautiful agricultural land into a resort with a golf course, it could probably earn the municipality a lot of income. So it may be inclined to do so. Yet it has a responsibility in terms of realizing the right to food, also in the way in which it controls agricultural land. And I think the ongoing litigation between the Philippi horticultural area and the city of Cape Town and the provincial government is a case in point of where this tension between food security and the pressure for development is placed out. And my interpretation of the pressure for development may be a bit of a cynical one, because of course there is also pressure on municipal land for development, for housing, for low-cost housing. So how does the municipality navigate that tension between the pressure for development and the need to control agricultural land? That's one example. Another example of how this town planning or municipal planning power can be used to increase food access is in how do municipalities apply this power? How do they use this power? What do the zoning schemes say? What do the municipal bylaws and planning say? How does the municipality use its leverage in terms of this town planning to create cities and urban areas where food is accessible, where people have access to points of sale for food, and are not dependent on long traveling times or the ubiquitous mall to go and buy their food. The experts will have lots of arguments here to link municipalities' role in planning and urban design and food security. So my argument is this links to the municipality's constitutional responsibility around municipal planning. So in summary, what I'm arguing in this chapter, in this paper, is that the Constitution, the South African Constitution, engages municipalities in the realization of food security, even though this may not be a very instinctively or a very ready-made argument on the basis of just looking at what municipalities are constitutionally responsible for. I do think the Constitution engages municipalities in food security on the basis of the right to food, where municipalities will have a responsibility to realize the right to food. Maybe not the full scope and extent of the right to food, that would be completely unrealistic, but certainly there are aspects of realizing the right to food that fall within the domain of municipalities and that municipalities must take responsibility for. We can argue that on the basis of the right to food, combined with a food systems approach to municipal powers. I think this is an argument that is relevant, not just for South Africa, but for any other jurisdiction that combines two things, namely a constitutionally mandated system of division of powers between levels of government, let's say devolution, where the Constitution sets out what each level of government must do. If you combine that with justiciable socioeconomic rights, in other words, where you have socioeconomic rights such as the right to food or the right to housing, the right to water, the right to social welfare, which can be enforced through a court. If you have those two things in your constitution, you're likely to run into this debate about how does the enforcement of socioeconomic rights by the courts, how can that actually change the division of powers in the Constitution? And these things are often seen as two separate areas of constitutional law that don't really speak to each other, because you've got the institutionalists and the federal scholars and the people who talk about decentralization. They deal with the issues of who does what. And then you've got the human rights lawyers on the other end, and they deal with the implementation of the Bill of Rights, and they litigate socioeconomic rights in the courts, and the two shall never meet. But actually they do, because the enforcement of socioeconomic rights has an impact on how we must see the powers and functions of the various levels of government. So I think this is something that will also be relevant in other jurisdictions. And there's already one example on our continent that combines these two things, namely Kenya. Kenya has a constitutionally set out system of devolution, with devolution of powers to counties, but it also has enforceable socioeconomic rights and a very progressive Supreme Court that is quite willing to enforce these socioeconomic rights. So it's going to be interesting to see how these kinds of debates will play out in Kenya as one example of a country where this would bear relevance. I want to end off with the question, though, that I think from a local government point of view will come up is, but what about the money? And is the intergovernmental fiscal system responding? If the courts allocate new functions to local government, will municipalities be properly equipped with either revenue sources or intergovernmental funding to make that happen? Because again, as I said, the Constitutional Court doesn't change intergovernmental fiscal relations. It doesn't give money. It doesn't change the way money flows in the system. The Constitutional Court will simply say, you are responsible and you need to find that money somewhere because that is your constitutional duty. But there is, I think, that problem of how our intergovernmental fiscal system is not yet adequately responding to the way the way that the division of powers and functions, and particularly the mandate of local government, is changing over time as a result of these court judgments. And I think this is an area where the National Treasury and the Fiscal and Financial Commission need to engage to look at how does that impact the way we distribute funding between the three levels of government. So that is basically what I wanted to present. And I think I will also make sure that I put a link into the chat box later of the of where you can find the details of the book should you be interested in buying it. And there's also, I think, an earlier version of that chapter that was published by the COE itself that should be available on its website. And I'll make sure that you receive a copy of that. But yeah, I'm very interested to hear what the views are of those in the room on the argument that I've set out. But that's it from me for now. So I guess it's over to Julian now, or Stephen.
Thank you so much. Yeah, a very, very thought-provoking presentation indeed. Yes, the working paper was published by the Centre of Excellence in Food Security here in South Africa, and Julian May, the director of the COE, is going to moderate the discussion. So you will be allowed as participants to raise your hand, speak, and also use the video if you want to. And you can also, of course, write comments and questions in the chat box. So over to Julian. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Stephen, and thanks for the invitation to UWC colleagues to present this seminar. It's very exciting to be part of a room of 100 people scattered, I suspect, all over the world. Although I was very warmed to see how many colleagues from UWC have also joined today. So I've been privileged to be the chair of the Dalla Oma Institute's board for the last 5 or so years. Prior to that, I had not really had much interaction with lawyers of any kind. And really the meetings have made me very aware, as someone whose career comes out of development studies, how blind we may have been as researchers in development studies to the importance of law and how law operates when it comes down ultimately to on-the-ground issues as to who, as the judge said, who is responsible. The Constitution is taken very seriously in South Africa. I think the events of the last 2 weeks really have demonstrated that. And the Dalla Oma Institute was very central in formulating the South African Constitution back in the debates around 1995 to 1996. So this is a deep concern, and I am delighted that Jaap and his colleagues rose to the challenge of what is the role then of the Constitution as a whole, and particularly subnational levels of jurisdiction in achieving a goal of food security. So we can take discussion on this. I have a few things which I'm going to pose to Jaap as once others have completed some of the issues that they might like to raise. As I said, there are nearly 100 people, so I can see the list of participants, so you're welcome to raise your hand to be able to make a comment. There's also the chat button as mentioned, so you're also welcome to type your questions into the chat button, which would make sure that people are able to see and read them. And lastly, if both things fail, then please just start talking so that I can pick up those that I might otherwise miss as I'm scooping through the people who have raised their hands. So let's start there with seeing if there are any people that would like to come in at this stage. Okay, I see Anuska, I see Harry. Let's start with, sorry if I'm not pronouncing that correct, but let's start with Anuska.
Thank you, that is correct. Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. I'm not from a system with this constitutional principle of devolution. So I was wondering, how do you divide the responsibility between different municipalities? Because I can imagine that if everybody allots no land for agriculture, no municipality does that, then you will have a clear human rights violation. But if it's just the one municipality, then there is no problem. So how would the courts deal with that?
Thank you. Jaap, I'm going to propose that we take 3 questions and then allow you to answer. So I'll go next to Harry.
Okay, so
please, could you just identify yourself and where you're from, because I can only see the first name on here.
I'm Harry May from Surplus People Project. So I've got 2 questions to Jaap. So the relationship between food security and access to land. So we had this battle, especially with the lawyers of the Legal Resource Center, around access to land, and all the municipalities from Stellenbosch to Swartland municipality to municipalities in the Northern Cape to the Free State, they say, but that's not their core responsibility. So in terms of participating in intergovernmental plans, and that's also part of the Constitution, if Jaap can respond to that. And secondly, for us as Surplus People Project, we're working with peasants, and we're part in solidarity with the movement that's part of La Via Campesina. And a key document for us is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and other people working in the rural areas. Now, if you go to Article 15 in the Peasant Rights Declaration that deals with food security and food sovereignty and the right to food. So what's your take on that? Because although South Africa has been a sponsor of in the United Nations of this declaration, I don't think, a lot has been done in the country. So, and how can we use, for instance, the declaration at the level of municipalities? So we had discussions in La Via Campesina of how to do this and how people are doing this in Latin America and Europe. But what's your take on how can we really make sure that municipalities also take up what's contained in the Peasant Rights Declaration? Thank you.
And then, Jaap, I'm going to read you a question that has come from Joe Mavusa. He asks, is food security an indirect, unfunded mandate or a direct funding? And he asks the question, what would the Auditor General's attitude be towards such funding? I will then pick up on the various other people in the next round of questions. So Jaap, over to you to respond to these ones.
Right, thank you, Julian. So let me dive straight into it. So Anushka's question, how are sort of these responsibilities defined? So, and it also comes through, I think, one of the problems in the chat about whether the Department of Agriculture is decentralized. So agriculture as a competency is listed in the Constitution as a competency of national and provincial government. You'll find it in Schedule 4A of the Constitution. So there the Constitution says both the national and the provincial governments both have responsibility over agriculture. We have a national Department of Agriculture, but we also have provincial departments of agriculture. They work very much hand in hand. They work very closely together because our provinces are highly reliant, highly dependent on the national government, both in terms of a regulatory framework, but also in terms of funding. So agriculture is, I think, for all intents and purposes, very much a national provincial issue. The regulation of agriculture, the funding of special agricultural programs is mostly done at national provincial level. At municipal level, it will depend from one municipality to another whether they have dedicated programs on agriculture. Some municipalities may, but the more urban, I think the more urban-oriented municipalities will not have a very big focus on agriculture because they won't see that as part of their core responsibility. But of course, what is agriculture? I mean, agriculture is just a word. I mean, there are so many aspects to that sector that intersect directly with municipalities. I mean, the provision of water, access roads, property taxation. There's just a whole range of issues that fall squarely within the municipality that have to do that impact on agriculture. So it's a very complex system of division of powers and functions. But I would argue that municipalities would take a sort of more peripheral interest in agriculture and a bit different from how vested national and provincial governments are in agriculture. The issue of access to land and municipalities saying that is not their core responsibility. So again, probably technically in terms of the Constitution, they are right, because the issue of land ownership, land reform, is not a municipal competency. It's not listed in the Constitution, which means it's a national competency. It's a national government that is primarily responsible for land reform and issues of land ownership and land administration. It is the land regulation, in other words, town planning, to use that awful term, is the municipal responsibility, but that has nothing to do with ownership. So that's the one part of the answer. Another part of the answer is that what I know is often a problem for municipalities is when they want to access land to put in services. It's particularly an issue, I think, in the rural context, where a municipality would be perhaps be willing to put in basic services for a community of farm workers, but the farmer doesn't allow the municipality access to the land. And even more so, the municipality would be reluctant to put in services, to put in pipes, to put in infrastructure, because it cannot do that on somebody else's land without a specific permission. So there are a lot of legal complexities that municipalities are also faced with when they want to assist farm workers with services. Now, the third part of the answer is that aside from all of those difficulties and limitations, municipalities obviously are the local state, and they have a responsibility to engage with their communities and to engage with stakeholders and to strategically plan and bring together actors into that municipalities. They cannot be defensive all the time and say, this is not my responsibility, or I cannot legally do it. They have to, basically in the words of the Constitutional Court, maybe not the exact words, but saying, make a plan. You are the local state. You have power. You have leverage. You have convening power. You are supposed to adopt an integrated development plan, which brings together three spheres of government and stakeholders and SOEs into a coherent strategic plan for that area. And of course, land reform will be part of that and must be part of that. And the municipality, it's not good enough for the municipality to say, that's not my lane. You have a responsibility over and above what you are narrowly responsible for in terms of the Constitution. So I think this also links to the third question: is food security an unfunded mandate? It depends how you would define it. So for example, if we were to say that because there is food insecurity in KwaZulu-Natal, each municipality must make sure that every destitute family is furnished with a free food parcel. If we would be saying that would be an unfunded mandate, because municipalities don't have the funding base to do that. We have a social welfare system. We have provincial and national departments of social development. We have feeding schemes in schools. We have lots of other avenues through which we can fill that gap, and just, parting that off to municipalities would be an unfunded mandate. However, if you were to say municipalities must plan and regulate their built environment in such a way that they make a contribution to food access. That is not an unfunded mandate, because that is something that municipalities must do in any event. They must do town planning. They must decide on where municipal roads are going to be. They must maintain roads. They must plan markets. They must regulate markets. They have responsibility over abattoirs, etc., etc. So there's lots of existing competencies that already intersect with food security, and municipalities have a responsibility to think through how they use those competencies in a way that contributes to food security. That's how I would make the distinction. Thank you, Julian.
Thank you. Then if we, I noticed, Prashottama, you had your hand up, but so let's go to you to ask your question. I see you did post it in the chat, but please, can you come in now?
Thank you very much, Chair. Sorry for joining in late. In fact, I never got to listen to the presentation, but basically my question is, if you're looking at the developments in South Africa in the last week, particularly in Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal, what lessons can we learn in terms of food security? And here I'm looking at the whole thing constitutionally, and then by the local government sphere. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Then I saw Florian, you had your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Jaap. Good to see you and to be reminded of your work in this space. I'm going to come a little bit from left field here. I see you've discussed, you know, the right to food angle here based on the Constitution and how that provides a mandate for municipalities to engage with food systems. I'm interested also in food environments, and Section 24 of the Constitution guarantees everyone the right to a safe and healthy environment, yet particularly if we look at supermarkets, but also in some of the informal sector spazas, consumers are confronted with environments which, from a public health perspective, are clearly dangerous and damaging if we consider the overwhelming presence of ultra-processed foods, which have been conclusively linked to issues such as obesity, diabetes, hypertension, other non-communicable diseases. So my question really is, to what extent does the local state, in your interpretation, have a mandate to intervene in that space, to regulate food environments within what would otherwise be considered private sector space? I'm saying this also because, you know, in conversation with various officials, they've said, you know, we'd love to have a basis to be able to intervene in this space, but there's currently no policy in place that would justify that. And so we can't really instruct town planners to approve or disapprove a proposal based on that reasoning. So I'd like to hear your view on that, as it seems that in that space, the right to food and the right to a healthy environment seem to intersect.
Thank you. And then I'm going into the chat box, and I see there is a question from Lydia. Lydia, it may be easier if you phrase the question yourself. It's quite a long chat. Could you come in now, please?
Yes, sure. Can you hear me? Yes. Hi. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. So I'm connecting from Brighton in the south of the UK. So I had a question about how food rights and entitlements are really understood, depending on where you put the emphasis in terms of responsibility, who's responsible for providing those. And I wanted to mention briefly, just here in Brighton, during this past couple of years, we've seen charities, local community organizations, social enterprises becoming really active in responding to the food emergency. And the local council has supported somewhat some of these initiatives, but they've relied mainly on private donations and volunteers, right? And this can be quite unstable. So there is a question of whether the re-energizing of society-led initiatives is excusing the local government of its own responsibilities, or indeed whether these responsibilities are at all recognized. So I was wondering whether, in the context that you study, you've come across this debate on the state, local state versus civil society organizations. being responsible for responding to these issues, and whether this matters in the ways that we understand food rights and entitlements. Because if you put the emphasis on the state of the role of the state, then we can understand them as rights that people have. Whereas when you have local organizations coming in, they come in as charities doing good to the people. So it's a completely different understanding of food entitlements. And so I was wondering whether you had any thoughts on these from the places where you've studied. Thank you, and thanks for a really great presentation. Thanks.
Thank you. Jaap, back to you.
Prof.
Yes. Please go ahead.
I would like to ask a question, but I can't see the thing so that I can raise my hand.
Okay,
on
fine. Please go ahead.
I'm not sure if. Oh, thank you very much, Prof. Thank you for this presentation. It sort of raises a lot of issues that we have let them lie under carpet. Just a comment first. Generally, the municipality has been complaining about the funding formula, beside funding food security, but for other basic services that within themselves as municipalities, it is not done equally. There's always been that the cities are getting more, which I think the formula, the money follows the people where there's more people. Now, this issue of food security is also caught in between that debate within the local government space. Now, coming to food security, I know you tried to link the municipality with the Bill of Rights. And I know I've been trying to look at this act, Prof, whether it's a Municipal Systems Act, Section 52 or 152, but I've been trying to pick up that now. I don't have it here, where it says the municipalities must, within their available resources, ensure that they address the socio-economic issues at the municipality where they are. I am not sure if now on your explanation you touched on this one, to at least to link the municipality to the cause to support food security and agriculture in general. That's one aspect that I think it is important also to pick up on. That act is either as a Municipal Systems Act or one of the acts governing local government directly beside the Bill of Rights and in the Constitution. Then quickly on the policy, I agree on the policy and bylaws that they could use those to create a conducive environment so that they contribute indirectly so to food security by creating opportunities for traders, markets, and so on and so on. Now, recently with the COVID-19, there was a big challenge with the city of Cape Town. They were willing to support the food parcels and all of that, but the financial system was not allowing them. They had to make a quick policy so that these are given under donation or grant. That money would be put under grants in aid for them to have responded to that. So which is quite a big challenge. Not all the municipality now would have that ability to look at that. So maybe I agree with this comments on the chart that maybe we need to look at this issue of our the funding to local government vis-a-vis the mandate and across all the other spheres. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you. I'll end it there so that Jaap has an opportunity to answer these 4 questions. And Jaap, Harry just makes the point that you didn't respond to the issue on the UN Peasant Rights Declaration and its relation to the Constitution. So if you could just pick that up. Jaap, to you.
Thank you, Julian. I think the declaration, I'm really not an expert on it, but I would imagine that it's one of those international instruments adopted at an international conference, and possibly even a conference of states. They adopt this as sort of an international declaration. Obviously, it in terms of our South African legal system, it doesn't have immediate legal effect in the domestic legal order because we have a dualist system of in the Constitution that doesn't immediately bring international treaties and international declarations into domestic law. It needs to be converted. It needs to be turned into domestic law before it would have any legal effect. But of course, declarations such as those should have and do have a very strong persuasive effect and can be used in arguments and sometimes also get referred to by courts, particularly the more progressive.
Please can everyone mute?
So yeah, that's in short is my answer, and I don't know the details of that declaration, but that will be my answer to that. PS questions on what lessons we've learned around food security. Again, I'm not really, I don't want to position myself as a food security expert, but I mean, one thing that I think we have learned is certainly during the COVID pandemic, and I think still of course ongoing, the importance of government response to it is the absolute critical importance of sound and effective intergovernmental relations. That when the pandemic hit and South Africa went into lockdown, many people have said, intergovernmental relations went in overdrive. We suddenly, national, provincial, and local governments were really forced to talk to each other almost on a daily basis. We had a president's coordinating council where the president meets with all the 9 premiers and a metropolitan mayor, and when a representative of local government. It was quite a sleepy affair. Normally they would meet every quarter and nobody would quite know about it, but suddenly under COVID they met almost every week. Every Saturday morning they met and they were coordinating the response to COVID-19. I think that was an absolutely critical lesson and it had impact on food security. Another lesson, a more sort of, I think, blunt one, is the nastiness of politicizing food relief. Within no time we had endless reports of food parcels being distributed to friends, food parcels being looted, food parcels being stolen, councillors getting involved in the distribution of food parcels in ways that was really unseemly. So I think that was also a lesson and prompted provincial government to say, municipalities, maybe you should stay out of this food distribution because when we see too much corruption there. So I think that was a very sad lesson that we learned around this issue. Florian, yeah, food environments. I mean, I find it difficult to argue that municipalities do not have a role to play there, because municipal health services is a critical part of a local government's constitutional responsibility. So it's actually much easier to argue there that municipalities have a role to play in ensuring that environments and food environments, markets and the areas around malls and public places, streets, pavements, that they are conducive places for whatever purpose they are being used for. So municipalities have a responsibility around cleansing, around safety, around security of those places, and have a role to play. Where it maybe become more difficult is when it takes place on private property. So municipalities obviously are not immediately involved in running malls. These are all private enterprises. So if the issue plays itself out there, then municipalities' jurisdiction will be limited. But any public place that is under the control and jurisdiction of a municipality, the municipality has a responsibility to make sure that those places are conducive for whatever purpose they're being used. And if they're being used for food sales related purposes, then of course the municipality must take an extra care to play that part. The issue that Lydia raised around food rights and society-led initiatives, perhaps excusing local government, I may not be well placed to give you a very direct answer, but I can say that I think one of the difficulties in this debate is that there is, and this is something that applies, I think, not just in South Africa, but something that municipalities do complain about a lot. And I think they have a point there. And local government in general, I think, complains about this, to say that because we are at the bottom of the food chain, and because we are the level of government that is the closest to communities and to people, we often have to sweep up where other organs of state or other levels of government fail. And we often have to fill the gaps that are left by others. And we become a de facto sort of, we play a de facto welfare function. And we're not actually properly equipped and funded for it. Because municipalities are not equipped and not funded to play a social welfare function. It's not how they are equipped and not how they are funded. And some of them even argue this whole concept of free basic services is actually a social welfare function that now gets passed on to municipalities. But okay, in this instance, it is funded because there is an equitable share grant that goes to municipalities that equips them to provide free basic services. But some municipalities will argue, just give us, allow us to deliver services. Don't make us a welfare institution. So that's a debate, that is ongoing. And I think in the context of South Africa, municipalities cannot escape that responsibility. But it does, I think, put a balance on how we look at these things. And it links very much to the funding formula. I think the last point that was made, and I agree with you, the Municipal Systems Act has that provision. It says municipalities must play their part in contributing to realizing the rights in the Constitution. It's in there, you're absolutely right. And I would agree with you that the funding formula needs to be revisited. And the funding formula and the way the intergovernmental fiscal system operates needs to take greater cognizance of the kind of duties that also the courts have placed on municipalities as a result of the Bill of Rights. Let me stop there, Julian.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Jaap. I see a hand from Azwangisa.
Thank you. Thank
Please
you
go
so
ahead.
much. Yes, I wanted to appreciate the presentation by a prof. And then I wanted it to link it. Here in South Africa, you have the National Disaster Management Act, wherein there has been a role of district municipalities with regard to the issue of food security. You recall the Disaster Management Act prescribed that all district municipalities must have the so-called food banks. And for those who have been following what has been happening in our country, there were instances wherein there were a lot of scandals that relates to councillors who were found wanting with regard to the distribution of food parcels as the pandemic started, especially last year with regard to the level 5. So in essence, somebody said that then what has to happen with then how the AG will audit that, because from where we are seated, maybe I would like to hear Professor's view to that effect, because in actual sense, district municipalities have been receiving food, and then they will identify councillors to distribute those food parcels to communities. At some point, you'll hear stories where in those food parcels don't reach their intended beneficiaries. So by implication, then I think in terms in line with the Disaster Management Act, that's what the district municipalities has been doing to then distribute food. So in essence, from where I'm saying, I think there's a role that the municipality has to do in terms of food security. And then the other issue in terms, the municipalities in terms of the Constitution, they've got a responsibility to foster local economic development. As Prof has said, in urban municipalities that won't work, but in rural areas, in all, the majority of councils of late, even those that are amalgamated, they are mainly rural municipalities. you find in the only working economic sector is agriculture. So food security there, of late you find that municipalities, because there is this issue now called the district development model, though the issue of agriculture is a sole responsibility of the Department of Rural Development and Agriculture. In terms of this new district development model, wherein there is this issue to say all things must happen at the district model, and then district municipalities are expected to be centers of development. So then you cannot shun away from this issue of food security, because if you are to talk the rural economy is about agriculture. So my question to you, Prof, how do you then make sure, without maybe a policy directive now, to make sure that then a local government then becomes the enabler of this food security? Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm just scrolling through the questions in the chat. I feel I've picked up on most of them that were questions. There's a lot of input there, and I don't see any other hands up. You just give an opportunity to, and perhaps while I'm scrolling through the participants, Jaap could just take a quick look at the chat to see if there's anything you want to respond to there.
I can maybe take these two questions along, and then I'll be guided by you, Chair, on which other issues I can pick up on. Just the two questions from Az Viganvizi, disaster management and then the issue of LED. So I haven't seen this provision on disaster management, but if there is a legal provision somewhere that forces a district municipality to have a food bank, then I would find that a bit suspicious from a constitutional point of view, because we have rules in place in terms of which the national and provincial governments can assign extra responsibilities to local government. They have to follow a particular procedure for that. And a key element of that procedure is that the Financial and Fiscal Commission and the National Treasury are asked to give a view on how all of this will be funded. Because it's very easy for Parliament to adopt a law, or for a minister to proclaim a regulation that makes a municipality responsible for something, because those things are easily passed. I mean, it's just by the stroke of a pen, you can make municipalities responsible for all kinds of things. But we actually have laws in place that say you don't just do that. You first assess whether there's a proper proper funding arrangement for that. And I know in particular in disaster management, we have not done that. And we have made municipalities responsible by the stroke of a pen for disaster management responsibilities without actually properly thinking through how this will be funded. So I would want to know more about how this works, to see whether this is in fact one of those problems. And around the food parcels issue, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, this is one of the lessons that we learned, that getting councillors, getting politicians involved in the distribution of food parcels is probably a very bad idea, because one way or another, politicians tend to use that kind of patronage to secure their constituency, and we seem to have not been able to get over that, even in a pandemic. And I think it was quite shameful to see that also at local government level. And I don't think involving local government with the distribution of food parcels, I mean, leaving the issue aside of whether food parcels is a good idea to begin with, I think there are lots of experts who would have views on that. But assuming for a moment that you are going to distribute food parcels, involving local government in that, I think, is a good idea. But I would argue leave the politicians out of it, and rather set up a system where it is done from a much more technical point of view, where municipalities are involved through their public participation officers or their community workers to get involved in organizing the distribution of food parcels, rather than charging ward councillors or or other councillors with it. I don't think that was a good idea. The LED and district development model and how to get agriculture involved. And I think it's a critical point, because we have very much still a one-size-fits-all system of local government, where we have those lists that I showed on the slide. These are the powers of local government. And whether you are a city of Johannesburg or whether you are a Mvaba municipality in the Eastern Cape, these are your functions. That's actually what the Constitution says. And of course, you know, the reality in those two municipalities is couldn't be further apart. And you could argue that a city of Cape Town maybe shouldn't be overly concerned with agriculture, because it's not a huge issue in cities other than urban agriculture, which is a very specific dimension. But you know, your rural municipalities, they're not looking for more powers on electricity generation or more powers on public transport. They may be much better served with greater involvement in agriculture. And so maybe we need to move away from this idea that all municipalities should have the same set of responsibilities. Of course, much of this is aimed to be realized through this new flagship of government, the district development model, where the whole of government is supposed to work together in a particular district area. And arguably, the national and provincial Department of Agriculture will sit down with the local municipalities and the district municipality and together craft a plan and a one budget for that entire area, and all of government will come together and work together and will be one happy family through that district development model. That's how government presents it. But we all know that the reality is different. Each department has its own budget and has its own targets and has its own interests, and will defend its turf and will be reluctant to work together. And so there's a lot of, I think, bit of silly ambition in that district development model, where we expect all of these things to some seemingly work together at local level. And I don't think it's working. I think it's a bit of a hollow promise. And I think it's much more important that we clarify much more clearly who's responsible for what. And that particularly the national and provincial governments take a much greater interest in the integrated development planning done by municipalities and actively engage with that, and to make sure that their plans cohere also at local government level. Let me leave it at that for now, Julian.
Thank you, colleagues. We've got about 10 minutes to go before we should close. I see we have a question from Andrea, and then I see in the chat there is a question from Paula. So let's go to Andrea first.
Thank you. Very interesting presentation. Thank you for the presentation. I found very interesting this. I think we need to connect the question that you said about what is the rule about the local government con the question about what is the participatory governance. Because I think the two elements are absolutely connected, because as you correctly said, the municipality have the responsibility to define what is your plan, what is your project that you have in area. I think we need to link this about the participatory governance, because the local government municipality system speak about specifically the constitution, and the local municipality system speak about participatory governance. And I think maybe can be useful to use this discussion about who is responsible, who is responsible to make some activity, to have some talk about what is mean participatory governance, what are the tools that we need in some way to develop this concept. And I don't know, I think the two elements are absolutely connected. Thank you.
Thank you. Paula, could you come in, please?
Thanks, Prof. Thanks, Prof, for a really interesting presentation. Just a quick one. I would like to hear your thoughts on whether you and your argument presented, if you're saying that the involvement of local government should be a sort of set in stone, if you think that, you know, the right to food and nutrition and all related can only be achieved with local government's involvement, or do you think it's as a result of provincial and national governments not being able to to do so. Say it was an oversight to, for lack of a better word, to say that the responsibility is only provincial or national, or just your thoughts on that. Thanks so much.
And then I think the last question to take before we run out of time would be from me. And a concern is if, as municipalities might take on greater responsibilities, we would then probably have the situation where municipalities that are better resourced, meaning that they have a greater revenue base, and municipalities which have greater capacity might be able to do more for food security than those that are not in that situation. What might be the consequences for widening inequality in South Africa? Passing it to you, back to you, Jaap.
Great, thanks, Julian. I also quickly want to pick up on I think a question that I saw by Anel du Plessis. Let me just scroll up. I don't think I've dealt with that one yet. Yeah, whether South Africa is WEF friendly, and if not, what may have to change in law. Optimization of the water, energy, food nexus. I'm afraid I'm going to cop on that one a bit because I don't think I'm an expert there, Anel. I think you're probably much more of an expert on it than I am. But yeah, I note the question. I think it's a fascinating one. I think, and I think we obviously have big debates, and you and I have written about it together about, you know, the moving away from the one-size-fits-all approach, and that cities should be able to assume greater responsibilities for generating power, purchasing their own power, and also perhaps even in the water sector taking on greater responsibilities, which I think in the long run would have a positive effect. But over and above that, I'm not sure whether I have a whole lot more to offer on that question. Andrea's question about participatory governance. Now, I think it's absolutely key, and of course, it's the raison d'être of local government. It is the key dimension to local governance is this participatory approach and participatory governance. But I think in South Africa, we've sort of come to understand participatory local governance as sort of this contestation between an angry, deprived community that seeks basic services and a reluctant and underfunded obstropolous municipality at the other end. And there is this constant clash and tension between the two that we see almost with daily service delivery protests. And of course, there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done in that area to improve participatory governance. But I think the other dimension to participatory governance is, how does a municipality engage with, let's say, its local farmers, the local entrepreneurs, the local businesses, the local chamber of business? How does a municipality bring those stakeholders together in the interest of food security, for example? So that is also participatory governance, and it's expected of municipalities to play that role. And I remember somebody telling me a while ago that, you know, interviewing a municipality and asking them about participatory governance and asking them about how often have you met your local chamber of commerce, and they said, well, we actually never meet with them. So that's also a failure of participatory governance, that municipalities must engage not just with communities, of course they must do so better, but also with local businesses, local entrepreneurs, to find out how can we work together to improve the food security system in this area. And I think that should not be overlooked. Paula's question, I think it really requires a nuanced approach. I don't think it's a question of either or. It's not about if provincial and national governments fail to realize food security, then it is a municipal responsibility, or the other way around. I think food security, and then the experts here, I think will agree with me, is so much, it's such a complex area. It has so many layers and so many dimensions that you cannot possibly contain that in one specific responsibility or one specific constitutional mandate or one specific sector even. So there will be many aspects of that are scattered across the three spheres of government, but they all have a role to play. For example, nobody is going to regulate the behavior and the safety and the cleanliness of local markets than the municipality. That's the municipality's responsibility. And that is one perhaps tiny aspect of government's responsibility towards food security. And it falls squarely within the responsibility of local government. The same with municipal planning, deciding what land will be used for. Is very much falls within the domain of municipalities and what they must do so. But funding maybe the more social welfare element of food security and for example, nutrition schemes at schools is another aspect of food security, but it's located elsewhere. It's part of the education system. It's part of our social welfare system. You cannot charge municipalities with funding that because they are not funded and equipped to do so. So I think it is more complex. I wish it was as easy as you framed it, but the reality is very stubborn and very needs a nuanced approach and looking at what element of food security is best performed at what level of government. Thank you, Julian. Let me leave it at that for now.
Great, thank you, everybody. I think that's been an extremely lively debate. There are days when I get upset about what we have lost by having to go onto online services for so much of what we do as academics, but this is not one of them. This shows the incredible power of having this kind of facility where we can link researchers in the Global South through a seminar series that is conducted in the UK. Stephen, I'd like to hand back to you to give us some last thoughts and ideas. A post is in the chat which links to the research working paper on which this presentation is based. And then you will also note the link to where the recording of the seminar will be loaded on the IDS events page. But Stephen, if you'd like to bring us to a close.
Yes, thank you, Julian. And thanks so much, Jaap. At one point, we had close to 100 participants, and I'm sure you felt like you've just answered 100 questions. It has been, the presentation was just the first half, but the last 45 minutes has been fascinating. And I would really thank you for drawing our attention to an aspect of food security and the right to food, and the provision of food security and the funding issues, which has not really been focused on enough. I certainly hadn't thought about this connection between the mandate of a government agency or department or level, as in municipalities, and the importance of funding that adequately and where the revenue comes from. That link is obviously very crucial to achieving the right to food for everybody. So thank you so much for that. And I hope that your work in this area continues and that we see more work being done on this municipal level issue of food security and food rights, food systems, and so on. Thank you very much. And just to mention once again that the recording of this event will be on the IDS website. You'll find it on the advertisement page for this seminar, and you'll also find recordings of previous seminars in this food equity series hosted by the Food Equity Center at IDS. And we'll start again in September with more webinars then, so please join us in September. You'll see the advertisements coming out fairly soon. And with that, thank you to everybody. Thank you so much for your active engagement. Really fantastic chat and questions and comments and great discussion. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening and engaging.
Thank you all.